All right, so it's 12 o'clock. Welcome everyone to our monthly psychology grand rounds. Today we have the privilege of hearing Dr. Lisa Cohen present. And Dr. Cohen, I think you were actually our first grand round speaker last year, so it's lovely to have you back. For a little bit of an introduction, who is Dr. Cohen? So she's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, working in the Mount Sinai Beth Israel location. She has long been involved with clinically relevant research in a wide range of topics relevant to psychiatry and psychology. Her most recent research domains have included the risk assessment and psychological correlates of suicide, risk factors for and differential diagnosis of personality pathology, and various topics related to childhood maltreatment and pedophilia. Dr. Cohen is an author of over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and 2 books. Her third book, titled The Psychotherapy of Personality Disorders, Emergent Systems Theory as an Integrative Framework, was published in 2022 by Lexington Books. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the City University of New York and performed her pre-doctoral internship at St. Luke's in New York City. She received her undergraduate education at the University of Michigan, obtaining a bachelor's degree in psychology and another one in fine arts. She's going to be speaking to us today about emergent systems theory as a model for psychotherapy for personality disorders. As the event goes on, the CE link is going to be posted to the chat, so just keep an eye out for that. And then our chat is also going to be open for, the Q&A is also going to be moderated and open. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to post those there. And now it's with pleasure that I, introduce Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Dr. Palmese, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. So today I'm going to introduce a model, an integrative model of psychotherapy, which I've termed emergent systems theory. And there's going to be, it's a broader model, but it's going to be a specific emphasis on personality disorders. So what is the problem? Well, there are an enormous range of different types of psychotherapy. And so that leaves therapists, particularly people early in their career, with real dilemmas. How do they choose? Who's right? Who's wrong? Are there specific treatments that do best with specific types of disorders or with specific patients? So here's a graphic representation of some of all the different types of therapy there are, and it's sort of coming at you. And this is only a small amount. There's a lot of different therapies out there. So what are the typical responses? Well, one option is to pick an approach and stand by it, like religiously. And so here I'm referring to the Hindu parable of the blind man and the elephant. And so what's that about? So you have one blind man who goes up to the elephant, grabs the tail, and says, oh, the elephant is very much like a rope. And then another one grabs the tusk and says, no, you're totally wrong. It's a spear. And then another one goes up to the side of the elephant and says, no, you're both wrong. It's a wall. So the point of this parable is that they're all wrong. They're all right, but they're all wrong. They're looking at a total reality from a very limited angle. And I think that's what also goes on in psychotherapy. So here are some examples that I've encountered in my many years of training early career and student psychotherapists. So for example, a student might come in with a background in CBT and not much background in psychodynamic. And they'll completely miss the personality pathology and the trauma history for a narrow focus, say, on procrastination symptoms. Or you have someone come in with a really strong psychodynamic background, and they get a patient with panic disorder and OCD, and they miss how the ruminative symptoms are clouding all functioning because they're focusing on the relationship with the mother or in the therapy, and they're missing what's really focal for that patient. And then you have that problem between psychiatry and psychology as well. So among psychiatrists, you can have a over-medicalizing of the disorders. And so you might see a frequent overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder, and there is data to support that. So what you see is a psychiatric overemphasis on DSM disorders and on medication as opposed to treating the general personality pathology. Whereas psychologists can over-psychologize psychosis or mania or depression And there can also be a bias against medication. So you have all these different angles that are missing the bigger picture. So another approach that we see a lot is a kind of eclecticism. And this is an atheoretical grab bag as opposed to a true theoretical integration. So people will have a toolkit of strategies, but there's no unifying model to tie them all together or to guide treatment selection. So treatment selection is kind of arbitrary. So what is needed? So what I'm suggesting is we need a unified model of the mind-brain, something that ties together all the different treatment approaches and accounts for differential diagnosis as well as the appropriate interventions, and explains how different approaches are best tailored to specific clinical presentation, symptoms, disorders. It's kind of like a map of the entire therapeutic terrain. And going back to the metaphor, there's just one elephant. How can we have a map of the entire elephant? So what I am proposing today is emergent systems theory. And this is a model of the mind-brain based on complex systems theory, and it's coming from a neuroevolutionary vantage point. And what are the key premises of this model? Well, that the mind-brain carries its evolutionary history tucked within its structure, and that you can think about it as layered like an archaeological dig. And these different layers of the mind-brain mediate distinct psychological functions. And the different types of disorders reflect dysfunction at these different layers of the mind-brain. So this is really the key take-home point of how I'm integrating the different approaches. And it is a deeply developmental approach, both to differential diagnosis and treatment selection. Now, a developmental approach is implicit in psychodynamic therapy, where adult pathology is seen to reflect childhood development. And there you're looking at development across the lifespan. But my premise is that an integrated model of differential diagnosis and treatment selection addresses our evolution across the species. And this is actually a pretty well accepted notion in neuroscience, but is very poorly integrated into clinical psychology and psychiatry. So why would this be helpful? Well, as I said, I think it can provide a window onto differential diagnosis. And the emphasis here, this may seem obvious, but it's not obvious in practice, is that not all psychopathology is the same, that they are qualitatively different. And it gives a reason why some interventions will work with some disorders or symptoms, but not others. Okay, so before I go further, I want to address a certain caveat that what I'm talking about is a kind of localization where I'm saying that specific regions of the mind-brain are particularly involved with certain functions. And this is actually rather unfashionable. So there's a major movement in neuroscience to move away from localization to an emphasis on networks, asking what are the circuits involved in any specific psychological function. And the belief is that localization is simplistic and inaccurate, and it's certainly very easy to abuse. But what I'm suggesting here is that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because localization, when used carefully, can shed very important light on clinical material. So here is a picture of a phrenology head. And this I actually found in the basement of a building I used to live in, and I grabbed it and I've had it with me. I actually have it in my office, so people who have been in my office may have seen it. And this was from the 19th century. The idea was that you can divide the personality into 27 components, and that they all have local foci in the brain. So here you might see that under the eyeball, language processing. So it's quite arbitrary. So I'm not suggesting here that psychological functions are entirely localized. It's much, much, much more complicated than that. But what I am suggesting is that some regions have a privileged role in various psychological functions, and that this has really powerful clinical significance. So now I'm going to return to systems theory, because my model is emergent systems theory, and let's define a system. So simply, it is a whole created by the interaction of component parts. So it's the interaction that creates the whole. And therefore, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That is a concept from Gestalt psychology from the early 20th century. But it means that the qualities of the whole are irreducible to its parts. Now, systems interact with one another, and together they form component subsystems of higher order systems. And in this way, systems create a hierarchy of complexity. So all living things are composed of a hierarchy of systems, going from relative simplicity to relative complexity. So for example, Atoms are the subsystems of molecules, which are the subsystems of chemicals, which are the subsystems of tissues, to organs, organisms, groups of organisms, ecosystem, essentially. You get the idea. And within human systems, we already have a model of this in psychiatry, and it's called the biopsychosocial model, which dates back to the 1980s. Now, here is a diagram that shows the hierarchy of human systems. And I won't go into all the different levels, but note here that you have these which are in the sub-psychological, more physiological realm. And out of that emerge human psychology, higher order systems. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the mind brain. But above that, emerging out of that, you have the social systems. So this talk is going to be about this region, the mind brain, but keep in mind that it's always part of a larger system hierarchy, and it's nested between the sub-psychological, biological, and the social systems. It's just I don't have time today to address that here. But also notice these arrows. So what that means, this is the direction of influence, because these different system levels interact with each other. And when the higher order systems influence the lower order systems, you're talking about top down. When the lower order systems influence the higher order systems, you're talking about a bottom up influence. So how is this relevant? This may seem awfully abstract, but it explains the relationships between pathology at different levels of the mind brain. And that pathology at one system level can cause secondary pathology at another level. And distinguishing the levels involved and the direction of influence is the work of differential diagnosis, top-down versus bottom-up influence. And hopefully this will become clearer as the talk progresses, because now it's just in the abstract. Okay, and then one more point about systems theory. Why emergent systems? Because higher level systems emerge out of the interaction of lower level systems, and they create something new that didn't exist before. So I'm talking about irreducibility, that again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is a philosophical issue. That means that each system level is valid in its own right. And therefore, each level requires and deserves its own interventions. Okay, so I said that this model is based on neuroevolution. So let's turn to that. And we're going to start with the three-part brain. So all vertebrates' brains are based on a three-part brain structure. And this is the same in pigs and chickens and fish and humans. And it goes back to the evolution of vertebrates about 500 million years ago. So this basic shape is conserved across evolution, though in more complex animals, such as humans, it's elaborated beyond recognition. So if you look at an adult human brain, you're not going to see it, but it's in there. And what I found incredibly fascinating is that all vertebrate embryos start out this way, and then they diverge in embryonic development. And maybe you've heard the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's a phrase from Ernst Haeckel, who was a 19th century biologist. And what it basically means is that you can learn about the process of evolution by looking at embryonic development. To me, that's really quite extraordinary. So let's take a look at that. So this is a diagram of our three-part brain. And this is a 3 to 4 week embryo. And so you have the hindbrain down here, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And then 2 weeks later, 5-week embryo, it's starting to divide and moving towards what it'll eventually become. So down here, the hindbrain becomes the brainstem and the cerebellum, involved with motor coordination and a lot of physiological processes. The midbrain in humans stays pretty small, but is still very, very central for a lot of core emotional processes. Many of the cell bodies that for the neurotransmitter tracts that we target in psychiatry are here. Also the periaqueductal gray, which is a region that is very important for core emotional responses. And then finally, the forebrain. This is where all the action takes place when it comes to complex psychological functions. So this is a diencephalon that becomes the hypothalamus. It controls stress response and hormones. And then the telencephalon is where humans have really exploded. And we're talking about the cortex, the limbic system, parts of the basal ganglia. All right, so let's look at how the brain, that three-part brain, has evolved across evolution. Now, these aren't our exact ancestors, but still you can learn a lot about evolution by comparative anatomy. So here's the fish. This is the oldest part, about 525 million years ago. And here's the forebrain. Here's the midbrain, here's the hindbrain. So it's really clear there. Bump up 200 million years to the reptile, we're now on land, forebrain's getting bigger. Midbrain's getting squeezed a little bit, but the hindbrain's still strong. And then you bump to the birds. Now, we didn't descend from birds, but we can still look at them. And they descended from dinosaurs about 160 million years ago. And here you can see the forebrain's getting bigger, still overlapping the midbrain, hindbrain's pretty strong. Now we bump up to the mammals, and what you're looking at here is the cortex. And the cortex is the upper level of the telencephalon. So it's folding over the diencephalon, you can't see it, and it's folding over the midbrain, you can't see that. And it's getting wrinkled, it's getting crenellations, which means it's so big it's folding in on itself. Now we bump up to apes about 17 million years ago, and this is the cortex, looking pretty human, but the cortex is really exploding, and you can see all these wrinkles. Again, you can't see the midbrain, you can't see the diencephalon, and it's starting to fold over the hindbrain too. And then you bump to humans 200,000 years ago or so, and the cortex has become a monster. It's like the monster that ate Cincinnati. And you don't see really anything else. It's under there, it's still under there, but you can't see it from the outside. And it's also folding over the hindbrain too. So where does our history go in our brain? So when it comes to the human brain, our past is not lost. It's layered into our very anatomy. So here's a rather sloppy way of breaking the brain into layers. So these are 4 layers. The bottom layer combines 1 and 2. And this is what I'll be talking about as we move forward. So Jack Panksepp had a 3-tiered model of the mind brain. And all of my ideas are adaptations from him. And he was a pioneer of affective neuroscience, which is the neurobiology of socio-emotional functioning. And he studied that in detail, and I think was a real giant in the field. And he did that for decades and decades. And when he started out, he was actually a renegade because neuroscience was cognitive and they were dismissive of emotion. So he had a 3-level model of the human brain, and he was influenced by Paul MacLean's theory of the triune brain, which has been popularized. So you've probably heard of the lizard brain or the limbic brain. That comes from MacLean. So what I'm going to do is take Panksepp's 3 levels and divide them into 5 psychological levels of the mind brain. Again, just a reminder that they're nested within the larger systems hierarchy between the physiological, somatic, and the social. Okay, so these are Panksepp's model. There's the primary emotional systems, which is in the lowest level, oldest part of the brain. And these are core emotional systems, unlearned, similar to instincts. And then you pop up to the lower parts of the forebrain. And this is where these systems get elaborated by simple learning and memory. And then you pop up into the cortex. And this is where these systems get elaborated by concepts. So this is the tertiary emotional system. So I am keeping those systems, but renaming them. So the primary emotional system I've called the unlearned core, and I've divided it into the survival and social systems. The secondary emotional system I call preconceptual learning, and tertiary emotional system I call conceptual learning, and I divide it into basic and verbal conceptual learning. So let's start with the bottom. This is the unlearned core, and you can see this is the area in the brain that we're talking about. So the survival systems are 500 to 300 million years old, social 200 million years old to the onset of mammals. And these involve the oldest part of the brain, the hindbrain, the brainstem, the midbrain, including the periaqueductal gray, and the oldest parts of the forebrain, the diencephalon, and the lower part of the telencephalon. And what this process is, and you don't need to remember all those details about the brain if you're not familiar with them, but what this process is unlearned emotional behavioral patterns. And these are the most primitive and most powerful elements of our emotional life. And in fact, if you stick an electrode in certain parts of the periaqueductal brain, in the midbrain, you can elicit sheer animal terror and sheer animal rage in a human. So you can think of these as mediating fixed action patterns, which are fixed responses to preset stimuli. And when there's variation in these responses, it's mainly genetically mediated. It's not learned. So what are Panksepp's emotional systems? Well, so as fundamental emotional systems anchored in the unlearned core, genetic and etiology, and wholly subcortical. So the survival systems are, he calls lust, fear, rage, and seeking. And seeking is like an all-purpose motivational machine. It's the dopaminergic reward circuitry. And these systems are talked about throughout biology, and they're known as the 4 Fs: fight, flight, food, and fornication. And you can replace the last F with another one if you so desire. So the social systems are care nurturance, which is the mother's attachment to the infant; panic sadness, horrible term, but it's the infant's attachment to the mother, and also referring to separation distress. And then play, all juvenile mammals have play, where they're joyfully trying out skills that they'll need in adulthood. So what are the relevant psychological disorders? Here's where we get into differential diagnosis, and this might be a little more controversial. So what I am suggesting is that the major mood disorders, such as bipolar and endogenous depression, and the major psychotic disorders, schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, are anchored in the unlearned core. That is, the unlearned core has a privileged role in their process. And what's the evidence for this? Well, these disorders have high genetic heritability, higher than their environmental etiology. And the primary treatments target cell bodies in the midbrain and the brainstem. And also the symptoms map onto Panksepp-7 systems. So for example, with depression, you see suppressed lust, seeking play, and sometimes rage, and you see elevated fear. And with mania, you see the opposite: elevated lust, seeking rage and play, and suppressed fear. And the first line treatment for these folks is medication. And treatments based on learning and memory may be useful, but they're ancillary. They are not the first line treatments. So let me give you a case example. Someone I treated on internship, which was like 30 years ago. Filene, we'll call her, 52-year-old woman with schizoaffective and borderline personality disorder. And she had the delusion that every night 800 Mexicans would burst in through the window and rape her. And she knew this because every night she put a Kleenex between her legs, and every morning it was mussy. That's the term she used. And she spent many years running across the country, staying in hotels, boarding up windows with wood. And sometimes she would punch people who she thought might have raped her. So when I met her, she'd already been discharged from the hospital. She was stabilized on antipsychotics, and all her delusions cleared. And she was happily settled in a residence and had a part-time job delivering mail, which she was very proud of. She still thought she had been raped, but it wasn't happening now. So what are other conditions of the unlearned core? Where I'm going to also anchor the temperament component of personality here. And I'm going to reference Robert Cloninger, who defined personality as equaling temperament plus character. Basically, temperament is genetically mediated, character is learned. And so temperament is more genetically heritable than learned. The learning can influence, but it's really more heritable. And this is somewhat controversial, but I'm citing Ken Kendler's study, where he did a wonderful study, epidemiological twin study in Scandinavia, because they have socialized medicine, and that's where all those studies are done. And so he looked at the heritability of the 10 personality disorders and found that on average, they were 30% genetic and 70% environmental. And traits such as extroversion, introversion, impulsivity, et cetera, have a high genetic component. So that's temperament. And temperament is typically not the focus of treatment. Generally, we see temperament as a normal variation and not pathology, but we do have to keep in mind what aspects of people's personality is genetic and what is learned. So I'm going to mention one other treatment that targets the unlearned core, and that's relaxation therapy, because therapists use this all the time. And what it's doing is targeting hyperarousal, which is found in a number of different disorders. So it's using largely physical processes to calm the survival systems: fear, rage, seeking, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, et cetera. And the point I want to make here is that it's operating at a lower level than other psychotherapy techniques. All right, let's bump up to preconceptual learning. And now we're in the lower part of the telencephalon. And you can see it's higher than we were before. Okay, so this is preconceptual learning. It's higher, but still subcortical levels of the telencephalon. We're involving basal ganglia, amygdala, nucleus accumbens. It's built on top of the unlearned core, but it modifies those systems with learning and memory. But importantly, memory is cue-based. And what does that mean? It means out of sight, out of mind. And I had a cat who would always freak out whenever the vacuum cleaner came up. That was the cue. She'd freak out and run away. But when the vacuum cleaner went back in the closet, she totally calmed down. And so it was out of sight, out of mind. So the point here is that learning is preconceptual because it doesn't involve concepts. And what are concepts but representations of objects or events that can be thought of when removed in time and space? So we don't have that here. So what psychological functions are involved? Conditioned learning, operant and associative conditioning, habit learning, learning to pair cues with a specific response. And what disorders can we link to this level? Symptomatic behavior that involves inappropriate responses to various cues, such as anxiety disorders, phobia, panic, obsessive compulsive disorder, addictive disorders, impulse control disorders, and the emotional volatility associated with personality disorders. And all of these presentations are linked to preconceptual brain areas such as the amygdala, the caudate, the nucleus accumbens. So what treatments would we be using to target symptom presentations at this level? So interventions relevant to cue-based learning, specifically behavior therapy, and where we're trying to decouple the problematic response from the cue. So associative conditioning is used for anxiety disorders. So gradual desensitization, flooding, exposure and response prevention. You're exposing the person to the feared cue and keeping them there until the connection extinguishes and the cue no longer elicits the same response. For impulse control disorders, you might have operant conditioning, where problematic behavior is punished and positive behavior is rewarded. And for addictive disorders, you can train people what the triggers are for craving. So in AA, they talk about avoiding persons, places, and things that can be a cue for a craving for alcohol. And then there's another approach to problems at this level, and these are skill-based treatments. So you're actually using cognitive approaches to train people to learn alternative modes of responding to triggering situations. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is an example of that. So let me give you another case example of someone with problems at this level. So we'll call her Sarah, 31-year-old person with severe borderline personality disorder and severe emotional behavioral dysregulation, had a horrible history of childhood trauma, terrible parental domestic violence was the main trauma. Despite all this, she was relatively high functioning. She got a college degree and she had a job that was pretty demanding, but she would get into really sick relationships with men and they would have constant fights, and the fights would be a cue to dysregulate. So after a fight with the partner, she would go to a casino and she would smoke cigarettes all night until physically ill. And then she would gamble until she was thousands of dollars in debt and come home drained and ill. So the cue was the fight, and this was the dysregulation of the seeking behavior, really. She was on medication. It helped somewhat, but it really didn't do much. So here, this is at a different level. Medication didn't do it. It may help a little bit, but it didn't really manage it. So this is where something like DBT would probably be best targeted. Now we're going to pop up to the basic conceptual level. Now we're moving into the cortex. So I'm going to speculate this dates back 14 million years ago to the arrival of great apes. And we're talking about the medial cortical regions in the limbic lobe, hippocampal region, cingulate. And there's a lot of research, more recent research, on medial frontal regions, cortical midline structures, default mode network, all kind of in there, associated with the kinds of psychological processes I'm about to talk about. And here, emotional responses are influenced by concepts. Again, representations of objects and events that can be thought about when removed in space and time, like Piaget's object permanence. So what psychological functions are we talking about? Well, in general, cognitive functions that have to do with affect, because it's in the cortex, but it's still close to the lower level emotional brain regions. And more specifically, interpersonal representations. And this is going to be familiar to a lot of people, but what are these? These are representations, schemas, prototypes, or maps of self and other in relationships that are based on schematized memories of salient attachment relationships in childhood. And their role is to guide cognition, affect, and behavior in interpersonally salient situations. They're maps. So for example, an abused and rejected child will learn to expect rejection and then may avoid intimacy or become totally depressed when they're afraid that they're going to be rejected. So what we see here is a top-down influence on emotion and behavior, but it also has a bottom-up influence on complex cognition on the verbal conceptual level, in that it biases cognition. So these interpersonal representations are conservative and difficult to change, and they generally operate outside of consciousness. So what disorders are linked to this? Well, primarily I'm talking about personality disorders. And remember that I said Cloninger said that personality is temperament plus character. Well, this is character. And character is a function of interpersonal representations, also known as schemas, which is easier to say. So personality disorders derive from maladaptive interpersonal representations. And these are negatively toned, rigid and inflexible, and cannot assimilate new information. So a person may have a schema that I am unlovable, and no matter who is affectionate to them, that still doesn't change. Now, this is a very, very common model. I certainly didn't make this up. It goes back at least 80 years, starting in psychodynamic therapy and theory. Attachment theory brought it into the laboratory. Schema therapy is more recent and connected it with cognitive therapy tradition. And then in 2013, the DSM-5 published an alternative model of personality disorders that was based on this approach. So as I noted above, the basic conceptual level regulates the lower level and directs emotional and behavioral reactions. And much of PD symptomatology reflects top-down dysregulation of cue-based emotional and behavioral responses, such as Sarah. So what is the evidence for anchoring personality disorders in the basic conceptual level? Well, one, there's a very, very strong association literature on the association of PDs with childhood environment, particularly maltreatment, childhood trauma. And there's evidence of much lower genetic influence on personality disorders than the major psychiatric disorders. So as I said, from Kendler's study, PDs were on average 30% genetic, 70% environmental. And there are studies, meta-analytic studies of mania and schizophrenia that show them to be about 80 to 85% heritable and maybe 81% heritable in schizophrenia. Now, that's not conclusive, but the data points in that direction. Not only that, there's a lot of literature of these relevant brain regions linked to both self and other representations. And Northoff's study in 2006 is one in particular. And also research preferentially links maladaptive early schemas to personality disorders versus the major mood and psychotic disorders. So this is my own research, and this was looking at Young's schema questionnaire. So there are 5 domains of maladaptive schemas. And I looked at the relationship of borderline personality disorder. It was a sample of inpatients and their relationship with, here are 2 specific schema domains. And then I also looked at people with schizoaffective, bipolar, and MDD and how that related to these schema domains. So, and co-varying for comorbid disorders. So these are the people with borderline personality disorder. And you can see that if someone has BPD, they're like 6 to 8 times more likely to score high on the disconnection rejection domain after co-varying for comorbid disorders. And here are the mood disorders. And after co-varying for comorbid borderline personality disorder, you see a much, much, much weaker relationship. And then that's replicated here with impaired autonomy. So here, these folks are perceiving themselves to not be able to take care of themselves and be dependent on others. These folks do not perceive themselves, no relationship here. However, these folks are much more likely to actually be impaired because they have serious mental illness. These folks shouldn't be all that impaired, but they perceive that themselves. So I think it's a nice distinction of the role of interpersonal representations. Get this to move. There we go. So what are the relevant treatments in this level? Well, the primary treatments for PDs need to address interpersonal representations. So there are lots of treatments out there: psychodynamic treatment, schema-focused therapy, mentalization-based therapy. And when there is a shift in schemas, this will result in improved emotional behavioral regulation. And for true personality change to occur, however, treatment has to engage the affective experience. So the person has to feel differently about self in the world, and just intellectual insight won't do it. Now, DBT addresses, as I said, the top-down effect of maladaptive interpersonal representations on preconceptual levels. And that is necessary. Sometimes you have to do that first because they're out of control. However, it's not going to change the schemas themselves. And indeed, research shows that DBT treats symptoms more than interpersonal representations or general personality pathology. So they're operating on distinct levels, and they're distinct treatments for those distinct levels. I'm going to go back to Filene as a case example. So I mentioned that with her schizoaffective, she had comorbid borderline personality disorder. And she had a terrible childhood, a horrible history of rejection and abandonment. She was a biracial child born in the South in the 1930s to a white mother and a South Asian man. And this taps into the social level. As I said, everything's nested underneath the social level. So her father died at age 5. Her mother remarried to a white man and then decided her biracial child was a liability. So she got rid of her. She dumped her in a convent and never saw her again. So this kid lost her father at age 5 and then lost her mother. Now, despite this patient's psychosis, her behavior reflected an abandonment schema. How do I know that? Well, she had kids, and when her older child was 5, she abandoned her. And when at the end of my internship, I told her, I'm going away, my internship's over. And then she never came back. So I called the residents, and the caseworker told me that she had run away, and that the last they saw of her, she was walking away from the residence with 2 large suitcases in her hands. And then I think there's psychodynamic meaning to her delusions. So all of these people raping her meant she was wanted, and she would smile when she would talk about it. And why were they Mexican? That may have been a proxy for her non-white father's family. And in truth, her father's family did come to get her 10 years after she was abandoned in the convent, but she ran away from them. And she said she ran away because they were too strict. But think about it, how much more strict could they be than a convent? So I think once again, when her abandonment schema is triggered, she runs away. So now we're going to pop up to the last level we'll discuss today, which is the verbal conceptual level. And that's the outer part of the cortex. So this is the newest and most uniquely human level, dates back 200 to 500,000 years ago. We're not in the millions now, the thousands. So the beginning of Homo sapiens, or probably earlier hominins, maybe Homo erectus, all very speculative, you can see. The outer part of the neocortex, especially the frontal lobes. And this mediates complex thought, intellectual functions, abstract thought, planning, language, the ability to mentally manipulate concepts, and to reflect on time and causation. Also to think about emotion, which is metacognition and introspection. But while the cognition of the basic conceptual level is hot cognition, this is cold cognition. It's more distant from emotions. So what are the relevant disorders? Well, cognitive disorders, learning disorders are certainly involved up here. And lower level disorders have implications up here. But what we're really going to focus on for personality disorders is 2 things. It's poor coping skills, which is a failure of top-down regulation of the cue-induced responses. So it's a lack of reasoning skills to regulate cue-induced reactions, immature understanding of time and causation, and not thinking through the consequences of actions. Now, the basic conceptual level, the schemas, regulate emotion through felt meaning. You know, if your schemas change, you may not want to punch people because you don't feel threatened anymore. But the VCL, the verbal conceptual level, controls emotion and behavior through reasoning. So you may still want to punch people. You may still feel threatened, but you might think, uh-oh, I'm not going to do this because I'm anticipating negative consequences. So that is a failure of top-down regulation, which is coping skills. But what you also see with personality disorders is kind of bottom-up mischief, where the schemas drive automatic thoughts, which can cause problems. So what relevant treatments do we use? We use skills training for poor coping skills, and we're training people to use cognitive reasoning to consider causation, consequences, and alternative responses. Those are executive functions. And so DBT is classic, anger management, assertiveness training, et cetera. That's what they're doing. And then when you have the bottom-up problem with the, kind of schema-driven thoughts, you can use cognitive therapy by Judy and Aaron Beck to treat the automatic thoughts. And you're training the person to use metacognition, that is to think about their thoughts, to alter the cognitions that promote maladaptive responses. So these are both extremely useful tools with PDs, and they help people function better. They are useful, they work, but they're not going to change the core interpersonal representations. They're not necessarily going to change the patient's felt experience. They're still going to feel unloved, unlovable, incapable, et cetera. And that's why many CBT schools are moving towards a schema focus. Okay, here's a case example. This is Martin, 55-year-old divorced man, cluster C personality traits, and he's dating for the first time in decades because he got divorced. So we had a first date, which was somewhat awkward, and afterwards went into a downward spiral of depression and panic. And so treatment then went into the VCL, the verbal conceptual level, and addressed his automatic thoughts and his cognitive distortions. So he had thoughts of, I'll never meet anyone else again, no one else is out there, I'm too old and unattractive. And so treatment identified those and then looked at the cognitive biases that biased his interpretation of events to keep his thoughts aligned with his maladaptive self-schema. So a cognitive bias might be the fortune teller era. See, one thing happened and that's going to, predict the rest of my life. And the self-schema might be, I can never get what I want. I'm not effective in getting what I want. Okay, so now that we've gone through all these different modalities, how do you apply this model to treatment selection? So the first, you identify areas of pathology and then maybe map them onto the system hierarchy. And this includes the levels below and above the 5 levels of the mind, brain, proper. And if multiple levels are involved, which is more likely than not, you prioritize where to intervene. So you look for the most pressing first, what interferes with safety or functioning, such as acute suicidality. And then you look at the most central, what is the primary pathology undergirding secondary pathology? So for example, if you're seeing grandiosity, is this coming from mania or is it coming from narcissism? Likewise, if you're seeing impulsivity, is this coming from mania or is this coming from borderline pathology? So that's going to absolutely impact where you intervene. But then you also have to think about what's most accessible, because sometimes the patient's just not willing to address the areas where you think they need to work. So you want to look at where does the patient have good insight and where are they motivated to change? So if there's some sort of acting out behavior that's going to get them fired, they might be more open to looking at that. And you're going to probably have to ship up and down across the course of treatment. So I feel like when I'm doing that, I feel like I'm moving up and down a scale. Okay, so in sum, emergent systems theory offers a comprehensive, integrated model of psychotherapy and personality pathology, and it's grounded in a neuroevolutionary framework and explains how different clinical presentations reflect distinct brain levels that arose at different points in human brain evolution. And although the mind-brain is one complex system, different levels have distinct psychological processes and distinct forms of pathology. And most current treatments are valid for specific levels, maybe 1 or 2, of the mind-brain, but none of them are going to treat all the different levels. And still, there's only one elephant because it's all one complex system that works together. So this is the book where I wrote all of this down, and I went into much more detail about the treatments and about the evidence supporting my model. And so it's available on Amazon, and there is a 30% discount offer, and this is the code right here. So thank you for your attention. It looks like I went through faster than I thought I would. So I'm open now to questions and comments. Stop share. Okay. So I guess Maria, looks like they're expecting me to finish in 2 minutes later.
All right.
There we go.
There's Maria. Okay.
I finished sooner than I thought I would.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, for your presentation. It's time for the Q&A portion. If you have a question for Dr. Cohen, please do put it in the Q&A section. I'm just going to format our screen here. Can you hear me okay, Lisa? Great. So let's see what we've got for you. You have a few questions already in the Q&A. first one is from an anonymous attendee. Can you please share that discount code again, please? Got just some accolades in the chat in case you missed them, because it really was a very intriguing presentation. So there's that discount code is in the chat for everyone who needs that. Excuse me. This is from, I don't know who, what the name is. It's just the email address there. And the comment is that yours was an excellent talk. What is so helpful is how you integrate all the neuro and biological information historically and how you move this into the aspects of clinical decision-making and treatment selection. This is so important as per our training of students. So that's a comment for you. A question from another anonymous attendee. How can clinicians learn your model and become proficient?
Well, I have a book, so you can buy the book. This was really an opportunity for me to kind of think through my own philosophy of treatment that's developed over the decades. Particularly, I worked on inpatient and I've worked on outpatient. I've done a lot of research. So it was a way for me to work it out. What I have not done is test the model. I think it would be interesting to, integrate it into a training setting and to see if it helps students learn. So at this point, all I have is the book. And so I'm certainly happy if you buy the book and you can really learn it, but I'm not doing trainings as of now. And the name of the book is The Psychotherapy of Personality Disorders, Emergent Systems Theory as an Integrative Model. I think that's the name. I'll put the name too.
Yeah, Lisa's going to recommend.
Okay, I'll just type it in because I may be remembering that wrong. I wanted to name it something about elephants, but the publisher didn't want me to.
I think everyone enjoyed the elephant title of this talk.
I have elephants on the cover of the book.
While you're putting the title into the chat, I'm just going to keep going here with your questions. This one is from Paul Moglia. For Filene, did her having delusional trauma develop into post-traumatic stress? And if so, what was its impact on treatment?
That's so interesting. She would come in and tell me, doc, it's really traumatizing to have been raped all these years. And so I thought to myself, is this DPTSD, delusional post-traumatic stress disorder? So we didn't go too much further than that. I imagine living on the streets, living whatever kind of dysregulated life she was living, she probably did encounter a lot of trauma. And she may have been raped. I doubt there were 800 Mexicans coming in through the window every night, but there may have been something that happened. Certainly her early life was trauma. The abandonment was, and she would talk about that very eloquently. That was just decimating to her. So whether she actually had actual PTSD, I'm not sure, but she said she did. And so that was interesting.
This comment comes from Sarah Block L. Kubi, and she says this is a very impressive presentation. I have learned so much.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Sarah and I know each other well.
We have another anonymous comment. Can you please speak more about interventions to change the affective experience component? Very interesting presentation. Thanks.
Sure. So psychodynamic therapy, what are we doing when we're operating at the level of interpersonal representations? What are we trying to do there? We are trying to shift the schema, right? But it's not just an intellectualized thing. You want to help people become aware of their schemas. You want to take the unconscious and make it conscious. But there'll be many, many people who will tell you, well, doc, I now understand why I am the way I am, but nothing's changing. So what you want to be doing is getting them to feel and think at the same time. And that's when everything shifts, is when you feel and think at the same time. So how do you do that? Well, see if they're upset about something. Frequently, they might be upset about something happened and they got upset. And then you explore with them what they're feeling and why they're feeling. And then if you can link that back to a schema, it has to happen organically, it can't be forced. But a lot of times you can link that back to a schema, and then they're having the feeling and thinking at the same time. So that's one way to go. Another way, there'll be people who are really alexithymic, and they'll just tell you, I have no feelings. And I think the way to go with that is body work, where you really start to help them pay attention to their body. Or, to their voice or something like that. Other things I've done when they're really alexithymic, because I really try to get them to do visualizations. Like they're talking about something I know has meaning to them, but they're not able to label it or access it. And I say, just relax your mind a little bit, see what comes up in your mind. And sometimes you can get something really loaded. So it's hard. In general, you find them when they're emotional and you link it to the schema, or you start talking about the schema and then they get emotional. So those are ways to link it. But sometimes even that won't do, and you have to work a little harder to try and stir up an emotional response. Now, keep in mind, it depends how healthy the patient is. If it's a very fragile patient or a highly traumatized patient, you don't want to get them that emotionally aroused, because then they'll disorganize. And you'll see that cue-induced behavior. So you have to titrate it to what they can handle. And if they come in with a lot of preconceptual learning impulse control problems, then you got to shore up those with either, cue-induced or some of the verbal conceptual level skills-based treatments to get them to have some control. So you have to titrate all of
that. Next question from an anonymous attendee. I encounter frequently in treatment the barrier that clients intellectually can change thought patterns or recognize biases in thinking or behavioral patterns through affectively, though affectively they don't feel differently. Have you come across treatments that access the experiential level effectively?
So that's exactly what I was talking about. And I think that really speaks to the challenge. I think we do need to give insight. We do need to help people develop insight. But I look at insight as just a framework. It's really a framework to hold them together before them to be able to access it. So there are some really interesting treatments that work on the body and that work on imagery that I think are really good at getting to this stuff.
This is from Paul Mobley. Dr. Cohen, thank you for a wonderful neurobehaviorally oriented treatment model. Wonderful, thank you. And this is from Adele Zinberg. Can you show the book slide?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you show the book slide? Maybe this question is about the title of the book.
More than happy to show the book slide. Front slide, how's this?
Okay, I think that does it. Everyone can see that.
They can or they can't?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Keep that up.
This is from an anonymous attendee. This is a very useful framework to think about diagnoses. Thank you. Keeping the multiple systems in mind, how should clinicians choose what problem to focus on and which intervention to use when the patient presents primarily with adjustment difficulties?
Is other system level. And one system level that I think we spend a lot of time at is the life structure systems level. So, remember I said the mind brain is kind of in the middle of the social. Well, there's kind of a layer between the mind brain and the social. And this comes from the work of Daniel Levinson, who wrote Seasons of a Man's Life in the 70s. And then I think Seasons of a Woman's Life came out in the 80s or 90s. And so he really looked at adult development in a way that hadn't been done before. And I don't think it's been done since, but I found it really intriguing. And what he talks about is the life structure, that people create a life structure. So that can be your family, your job, your neighborhood, your hobbies. And I include in that your belief systems, your values, your religion. And it's the life you have created over time and how that life feeds back into your experience. And I think healthier patients often come because of some sort of struggle in their life structure. So, and I think that's where adjustment is sort of typically happens. And so you're providing supportive therapy to help with that. Now, it could be that they then have dysregulated anxiety or depression. And depending on where you feel it would be helpful, you might suggest relaxation therapy. You might suggest medication, just going in at the bottom to just lower arousal or re-regulate neurotransmitter systems. Or you might, do some problem solving with them. It's probably more the verbal conceptual level. We spend a lot of time doing this with healthier patients who come in with an adjustment disorder. Also, when you have patients, and I talk about this in the book, but I didn't talk about that in the talk because I didn't have time. Supportive therapy is a very useful form of therapy. And I put that at the life structure level. We also do that with very ill patients, such as psychotic patients who are very concrete, who are not, they may have character pathology, but they're not going to benefit from the in-depth work. And you don't want to destabilize them. You basically want them to have the most comfortable life they can have given the parameters of their life. And I see that as supportive therapy in the life structure level. So I would say for people who are too low functioning or concrete or unstable, but are kind of stable wherever they are on medication. And also for people with adjustment disorders, we end up doing a lot of supportive therapy in the life structure level. That's how I conceptualize it.
Thank you for that. This question comes from Martha Sparks. Do you have a schema questionnaire that is helpful in clinical practice?
The Young Schema questionnaire is really excellent. And that's what I use to differentiate the psychiatrically mentally ill patients with psychiatric illness from the patients with borderline personality disorder. So it was really predictive of personality pathology. So I would recommend, I guess it's the Young Schema questionnaire version 3, YSQ S3, I think it's called.
This question is from David Dorfman. The conceptual framework you described could be applied to interventions for behavioral management of chronic pain, example, ACT. This is a question.
Yeah, I like to think that everything could fit in there. Maybe I'm being grandiose, but I like to think so. I do talk about ACT in the book, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And it involves a lot of different techniques, but I feel like it's really about the life structure level, because he talks about getting into your life, accepting your life. What are the values in your life? How do you want to live your life? And so I think it kind of operates on that level. But it also does a lot with behavioral therapy. So that's operating in the preconceptual. He also does a lot with mindfulness, and mindfulness is a tricky one. Where would you put mindfulness in? The way I conceptualize it is actually a very low level that you're entering in meditatively. You're entering in at the bottom level, and you're really calming down the unlearned core, and you're creating a kind of rhythm of the unlearned core that then spreads upwards, has a bottom up approach, and evens out the rest of the brain, which then basically clears the bushes to be able to think more flexibly.
Okay. Comment from Anna Hittner. Thank you so much for this presentation. And a question from an anonymous attendee. Can you share how you go about discussing a personality diagnosis with someone who doesn't have insight into this or has never heard of personality disorders?
That's a really tricky question. I don't generally tell people they have a personality disorder. I think our ways of labeling it are very stigmatizing. And what I do instead is I describe the phenomena. I'll say things like, I often make a distinction between psychological and psychiatric if they've got some sort of psychiatric problem or they think they do. I'll say, I think it's more psychological. I think that you had experiences during your childhood that have really affected the way you see things in the world and yourself, your perception of yourself. And sometimes that makes it hard to manage your emotions or to manage certain personal situations. And that's what we can work on together. So I keep it very experience near, and I really try to avoid labels. There have been a few times where we will talk about a label, but they bring it up first. And I'm always afraid to say, I think someone has borderline personality disorder. Now, other people have different approaches, but this is my experience, that they can have a real narcissistic reaction to it. But one time I told a patient that I thought she did, and she was thrilled because she said, I thought I was bad, and now I know I'm just sick. So it's kind of unpredictable, but I think We don't have good names for our diagnoses that are sufficiently descriptive and non-derogatory. So I will just describe the behavior or the dynamics that I see happening, which is part of the therapy anyway.
Well, everyone, we're at 1 o'clock. You still have a number of questions, which we sadly will not be able to get to. And just want to read one comment from Shilpa in the chat. Excellent presentation, Lisa. I'd love to bring this book to our training section to see how to integrate it into our psychotherapy training classes. So that's exciting.
That's fantastic.
Thanks everyone for joining us for Psychology Grand Rounds. And please come back in March. We will have new and interesting talks for you there. So we'll end it there and take care and have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody.